Hello, welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Hendersonville, an inclusive community of faith for all ages. We affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person and seek justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Thank you for joining us. I am Ann Talley, the Worship Associate for today. I invite you to check our website at UUFHNC.org to learn of our activities that relate to today's world. And please join us on Sunday morning at 11:30 for our Stones of Compassion and Beloved Conversations. I Call That Church Free by Reverend James Luther Adams. I call that church free which enters into covenant with the ultimate sources of existence, that sustaining and transforming power not made with human hands. It binds together families and generations, protecting against the idolatry of any human claim to absolute truth or authority. This covenant is the charter and responsibility and joy of worship in the face of death as well as life. I call that church free, which brings individuals into a caring, trusting fellowship that protects and nourishes their integrity and spiritual freedom that yearns to belong to the Church Universal. It is open to insight and conscience from every source. It bursts through rigid tradition, giving rise to new and living language, to new and broader fellowship. It is a pilgrim church, a servant church, on an adventure of the Spirit. The goal is the prophethood and priesthood of all believers, the one for the liberty of prophesying, the other for the ministry of healing. It aims to find unity in diversity under the promptings of the Spirit that bloweth where it listeth and maketh all things new.
Are 7 enough? Today, the words that guide us in our faith community are found in 7 principles included in Singing the Living Tradition, which is our gray hymnal. These hymnals are designed to serve as our sacred texts in other faith communities that might include the Bible, the Quran, the Tao, the Upanishads, and others. But for us, as Unitarian Universalists, here in this gray hymnal are the 7 principles that are supposed to bind us together. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience, and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and the respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. So this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about how well we are served by these principles and whether 7 of them really are enough. We need to go over something about theologies and whether these 7 statements are enough for us to cover what's happening in our culture today. These are definitely not the words I learned when I was a child and adolescent. I grew up attending Grace Episcopal Church in Jefferson City, Missouri. In those days, my voice was high enough for me to sing in the alto section. My sister was a soprano and my brother a baritone. We'd been singing in 4-part harmony since we were old enough to carry our parts in Frere Jacques, and we all played piano and then 1 additional instrument for band or orchestra. What I played was the cello. I loved the liturgy of the Episcopal Church. I loved the sound of 17th century English. I loved singing chants pretty much the way they'd been written since Gregorian monks set them to music. My love for the sound of the liturgy meant that I had no problems back then with the theology. In fact, I rarely thought about the theology. I made it through confirmation class, through baptism. I was baptized and confirmed, and all was well. Grace Church was an unusual congregation back then. Jefferson City was the capital of Missouri, a state that had not joined the Confederacy, even though there were thousands of enslaved black people and their white owners in the state. Lincoln University, an historically black institution, was instituted to teach the children of former slaves after 1865, and in many cases, the enslaved people themselves. Most of the members of Lincoln's faculty were members of our congregation, along with their families and friends. Mrs. Wright was the organist, and her daughter Josephine, the soprano soloist with a magnificent operatic voice. In a way, we were ready, much more ready than many of our colleagues, for integrated schools. Things were fine until I came home from the University of Illinois, having discovered that I was lesbian. That was a sin to Episcopalians and to my family. It seemed pretty much to be what God thought about things too. It was either God or my identity. So I had to choose one or the other, and that meant that I couldn't recite that liturgy anymore. I felt fortunate that I knew of an alternative, because when I was in Champaign, which is where the University of Illinois is located, I'd go into a Unitarian church and learn something about what Unitarians believe. Unitarians got their belief that God is one, rather than having a Father, a Son, and a Holy Spirit, which is what Trinitarian Christians believe. Before the 20th century, Unitarians were Christians too, as were Universalists, but Unitarians could not get their minds around that belief that God is one, divided into 3 persons. Back in the 17th century, it mattered very much what Europeans believed, and they organized councils of learned, wise men to figure out how to state all their beliefs. They ended up with 2 statements, one short and one long, and they called these statements creeds. They recited them every Sunday when they met together for mandatory worship. People who didn't believe in God as 3 persons in one were treated rather brutally by various inquisitions. In fact, they ended up being put to death. So whether your statement of beliefs was the longer Nicene Creed or the shorter Apostolic, it mattered a lot. Universalist primary belief had to do with what happened to us after death. Trinitarian Christians believed that people were judged after death and either went to heaven to be with God for all eternity, or to hell, where they would be separated from God forever. Roman Catholics believed that if a baby were stillborn, the baby's soul went to purgatory, and that was a place to be comfortable even though you weren't with God. Heaven, though, was reserved for people who had been baptized, so purgatory was sort of a halfway house. Universalists believed that a loving God couldn't possibly damn people after death to hell. They believed that everyone joined God, so that heaven really was universal. Their statement of beliefs wasn't called a creed, but they did recite it every Sunday, and this is what they said. God is love, light, truth, and spirit, the creator of the universe, whom we are called to seek, know, and love, and whose nature was revealed to the world in the person and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. So both Unitarians and Universalists were progressive Christians before the 20th century. That's when the movement called humanism gained adherents. Despite the brutality of the First World War, people whose ancestors were European developed strong beliefs in humanity. In the 1930s, their philosophers and spiritual leaders developed a manifesto about their beliefs, which they called humanism. And their common beliefs were agency, which is when we prioritize the collective and moral agency of humans based on the belief that humans can determine a correct moral path and work together to follow it. Their second belief was freedom, the principle that humans are entitled to rights and freedoms. The third is equality, the principle that we are all equal. And fourth, the value of life itself, the belief that life is valuable and that the human experience can be wonderful. The Humanist Manifesto was signed by 34 spiritual, scientific, and philosophical leaders in 1933, and it went back to European beliefs described during the Renaissance in the 15th and 16th centuries. Humanists believed that people might behave perfectly with kindness and goodwill, despite ample evidence that cruelty and violence were also part of the picture. Many Unitarians and Universalists were also humanists, so the recitation of belief statements became somewhat less common during their services. By the late 1950s, both the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church in America were actively looking for larger and hopefully wealthier denominations for merger. Various combinations were explored, but the one that held together the best were these two progressive groups, really thought to be more progressive than most Christians wanted to join. So in 1961, the Unitarians and Universalists merged to become the Unitarian Universalist Association. They developed a new hymnal with a navy blue cover. Most of their ministers were white men, although the majority of their members were white women, many of whom were active in a group called the UU Women's Federation. That group, along with a committee called Women in Religion, wanted to get rid of many of the readings in the blue hymnal where women were supposed to recognize themselves as part of male pronouns. These two groups of active and powerful women wanted to find readings and hymns that named women as women. They wanted to get rid of the patriarchy, and they wanted more women in ministry. And as a result of their desires, a UU minister named Walter Royal Jones wrote 7 statements of UU beliefs, which you heard earlier in this service. He called them principles, and he also wrote statements about the sources of those beliefs. In General Assembly 1981, with one dissenting vote, the principles and sources were adopted and were included in a new hymnal, the Gray Hymnal, in which masculine patriarchal readings and hymns were replaced by works that included and named women. For the last 40 years, Unitarian Universalists have used these belief statements. They were not intended to serve as a creed. It is not necessary to believe in any of them, or in all of them, but they do describe what most UUs believe to be true, and they have served our faith community rather well. I was glad to find them in the 1970s when I came back to the United States after being gone for 15 years. When Susan and I found each other again and joined our 2 families and our 5 children, none of the churches we tried out wanted us. Good thing I remembered the Unitarians. At least they didn't throw us out. These days, however, we have finally begun to examine the ways in which white people of European ancestry are very well served by our principles and sources, but not so much people of color. Whether they are African American, Black, Asian Americans, or Indigenous, now they are supposed to fit themselves into these European statements of beliefs pretty much in the same way that women were once supposed to fit themselves into statements that used the words he and mankind as universal. Now, of course, there's more to this than our principles. The extent to which people of color have the authority to manage their own practices and budgets is another matter. At one point, at General Assembly in Boston in 1969, delegates approved a proposal to give $1 million to a group called the Black Affairs Council. However, when it was time to transfer the money to the council, UUA President Robert Nelson West told the Assembly that, unfortunately, the UUA was bankrupt and had to let a lot of their staff go, and so they had no money to give. Many of the gathered delegates, black and white, refused to believe this, and they walked out of the Assembly. Most of the black delegates who left have never come back. They felt cheated and deeply wounded. The controversy over that failure to keep our promises is still with us, even as we have begun to take responsibility for what we know and what we don't know. In addition, back then, leadership of the association was almost entirely white. People of color who had attempted to reach ordination in order to serve as professional ministers were told that the truth was no UU congregation was prepared to have such a minister. The same was true for professional religious educators, as well as music directors and administrators. In the 20th century, most Unitarian and Universalist congregations were located in places where black people simply didn't live, did not attend school, or work. So both the AUA and the UCA were led by white men who, while renowned by most UUs even today, were either deeply patronizing in their attitudes or what we would call deeply racist. This faith community was almost entirely middle class and not particularly interested in attracting working class black people to their congregations. Mark Morrison Reed, one of the few black UU ministers who served an active UU congregation, ended up in Canada. He wrote a book called Black Pioneers in a White Denomination. And in that book, he quoted Samuel Eliot, who was the second president of the UUA, as saying, and I quote, "The lower classes, Negro and Chinese and various half-breeds, were more nearly brutes than anything I've ever known." In the 1950s, Samuel Eliot wrote another piece in which he said, "Thrift, skills, intelligence, and character are fundamental things that black race needs to secure." These attitudes about what black people don't already possess was shared by most of our leaders and our ministers and members. Small wonder then that when qualified candidates such as the Reverend Ethelred Brown and the Reverend Louis McGee presented themselves as potential candidates for parish ministry, both faith communities turned them away. They were told that our congregations were not prepared for black ministers and that no support was available to them from the UUA. So a very recent movement for Unitarian Universalists to learn about racism, about black theology, and how we have responded to the new group called Black Lives Matter is important. We're being challenged to look at our own history and actions supporting or rejecting racial justice. The primary group we're discussing is black, but of course Asian Americans, indigenous people, and others are included as well. It is really important to me that we have an opportunity to learn about what we think about what our principles have to say about all this. Two of our black leaders, a renowned poet and author named Paula Cole Jones, and UU minister, the Reverend Bruce Pollock Johnson from the UU Church of the Restoration in Philadelphia, believe that it's high time that there was a principle that addresses the issue head-on of racial justice. They have written a proposal for an eighth principle, which they want adopted by our association. If it's adopted, it will read like this: "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions." We're being asked to consider whether we want to support this proposal at our next General Assembly, which will be held virtually. Groups such as UU Ministry for the Earth, as well as individual congregations, are also considering the same request. What we know so far is that we're being asked to consider that principle exactly as it's written, without changing the wording or editing this text in any way. On the UU leader list, which is made up of UU professional and lay leaders, people are discussing the proposal along with the questions and concerns that I'm discussing this morning. Many of the people who have posted responses on the list say that the proposal is not written like the other 7 principles. A woman named Elena Westbrook from the Community UU congregation in Plano, Texas, wrote, "These are different in quality, not just in degree or scope." And a woman named Sally G. wrote, "I'm interested in adding the language of the proposed 8th principle to our purposes clause. It seems to me that an action-based statement belongs in our purposes and mission." So here's where we are. We have a proposal to consider. We are a congregation in the Southeast region where a recent hiring decision is connected to the resignations of the UUA president and many of the administrative staff. The association has changed its positions about hiring and about other administrative and governance practices. Nevertheless, we are not required to act on the proposal that's been submitted. We could decide not to do anything at all about it. I have no authority to speak for our board, for our social justice group called SJOT, and as far as I know, not for any of the other groups in this congregation either. There is no request that we consider acting on this proposal at our annual meeting either. We've had some discussion groups facilitated by Reverends Michael Carter and Judith Long, and attended by around 30 people from the fellowship. I've led several discussions on a book called The Black Friend on being a better white person, and some people have read Isabel Wilkerson's brilliant study of racism in this country called, simply enough, caste. Wilkerson's premise is that we have a caste system in this country that functions similarly to those in India and South Africa. Other people have read books like White Fragility, written by Robin DiAngelo, who's a white UU, who had her book published by Beacon Press, connected with our faith community. White Rage was written by Carol Anderson, a Black woman. Some people have read extensively about Indigenous history, reading titles such as Long as the Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice, and An Indigenous People's History of the United States, written by another UU, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and published by Beacon Press. There are titles coming out every month, and we are just in the process now of forming an organized effort to read and discuss what we're reading. In the past, we've participated in groups in Hendersonville, such as Feed the Kids, where we serve meals to the boys and girls at the Boys and Girls Club, and the Human Relations Commission in Hendersonville, which, to tell you the truth, is no longer in existence. Some people have signed an anti-racism pledge from the UU congregation in Richmond, Virginia. Some have participated with Reverend William Barber's Poor People's Campaign and have read Reverend Barber's books, such as The Third Reconstruction. So we've taken some initial steps to figure out what we want to do about racial justice. We have a group called Allies for Racial Equity, which is chaired by Judy Bonner, to help us with this work, along with SJOT, which is chaired by Charlotte Corrigan. They might be willing to help us look at this proposal for an 8th principle. So we need to figure out, is this something that we want to be familiar with and then just move on? Should this be a banner on our grounds? In your opinion, what is the right thing to do about this? I hope you will join us for our discussion at 11:30 this morning and use this as an opportunity to say what you think. Whatever happens with the proposal for an 8th principle, I hope we continue to learn things that go far beyond what we didn't cover in school. I hope we become more knowledgeable and informed, as well as much more accountable. May it be so.
Our closing reading today is by Anonymous. It is a blessing each of us was born. It matters what we do with our lives. What each of us knows about God is a piece of the truth. We don't have to do it alone.